that a perfectionist is someone who relentlessly strives for extremely high standards that are often really personally demanding, and they're often quite unreasonable standards as well. And this is very much then linked into how you judge your self-worth on your ability to strive for and to achieve and meet those standards that you set yourself. So you can already see how you're kind of setting yourself up for failure a little bit, in the sense that the standards are really high, a bit unreasonable, and your self-worth is based off of being able to meet that.
Hello and welcome to the Mind Detox podcast. I'm your host, Sandy Newbigging. For today's episode, I share an interview from one of my recent online club meetings, which you can join at minddetox.club. I talked to Natalie Englander, who's a CBT therapist and mindfulness teacher. We chat about perfectionism and self-worth. Being what she calls a recovering perfectionist herself, she describes some of the signs and symptoms of perfectionism and what you can do to start healing this unhealthy habit. Stay tuned, because I also chat to Natalie about self-worth, including how it's different to self-esteem and some simple strategies for making the all-important shift from basing your value upon who you are rather than what you do or achieve. And if after listening you want to engage in some therapy to heal the hidden causes of perfectionism or low self-worth, you can work with Natalie by going to her website, natalienglander.com, or with me by booking some sessions at minddetox.com. So hello and welcome to this chit chat with the wonderful Natalie Englander. Hello, Natalie.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming. This month inside my club, we're talking about self-worth. And a few months ago, we were talking about perfectionism. And I tried to get you then. But what were you doing? What was your terrible excuse for not being able to join us then?
I was having my babies. So not just one baby, a very good excuse. I was having two babies.
Yeah, couldn't really argue with that.
No, pretty good excuse. But I would have loved to have joined for your perfectionism month. But I think joining this time round with self-worth is good because they're very linked, perfectionism and self-worth.
To be honest, I thought I was going to make the most of our time together. So I'd like to actually, talk about both if you don't mind, because like you say, they're so tied.
Yeah, absolutely.
Before we do, we got to do the normal, intros. So you are CBT trained, mindfulness,
yes,
and you've specialized in perfectionism and self-esteem. Can you tell us a bit about your journey to this point as to why you decide to get into CBT and stuff, but also the specializing as well into perfectionism? That's really interesting.
Yeah, of course. So I guess it probably started with perfectionism when I was a teenager. And I think at the time, I probably didn't realize that I was a perfectionist because I tended to think, yeah, but I'm not perfect, so therefore I'm not a perfectionist. But I think I definitely was, because often my self-worth would be tied to my achievements, essentially. And I would sort of work really, really hard at school. I would most of the time get good grades and feel good about myself, but then I would just sort of raise the bar even higher next time and think, well, that was too easy. Or occasionally if I failed, then I'd feel really awful about myself. And this sort of just became a bit of a pattern, which got quite overwhelming and anxiety provoking. So at some point I did have my own therapy, which was really useful to learn and recognize, okay, maybe this is perfectionism. And it was just so useful because I realized that you can have high standards and be a high achiever without all of that sort of perfectionism baggage, should we say, all the not so good stuff about being a perfectionist. And I think when you have your own experience of anxiety or depression, those sorts of things, often that kind of drives you to want to help others who have maybe had or going through similar experiences. So I think quite quickly from when I was like 16 and studied psychology, I sort of decided, right, I'm going to be a therapist. And I mean, there are lots of different types of therapies out there. I'm sure lots of you here may have had some therapy. I certainly have. And I think I really liked the idea of CBT because it's really practical and sort of focused on the here and now and making changes. So not just talking, but actually kind of putting things into practice. So I think that always felt quite clear once I'd studied psychology at uni. Okay, yes, I want to be a therapist and I want to be this type of therapist, a CBT therapist. And I guess mindfulness is sort of a part of CBT, and a similar sort of journey in that I did mindfulness for myself, found it really useful, and then thought, this is great, I'd love to share it with other people, and wanted to train to be a mindfulness teacher as well. And I think there's perhaps something about when you've been through a particular experience yourself, i.e. perfectionism for me, you have such a good understanding of it, you can really relate to other people who have that same thing. And I think that it can maybe give you that edge a bit of kind of helping people manage it. And I think I just noticed that when I kind of saw people who had perfectionism or low self-esteem, that they sort of did really well by the end of therapy. And I thought, yeah, I think I really like doing this. I like working with women with perfectionism. I guess I'm a woman with perfectionism, so I can relate. That's not to say I don't work with men or like working with men. I do, but again, I guess I get it. I think kind of women have a unique set of pressures in society that I think can contribute to perfectionism and low self-esteem as well.
Cool, thank you.
So here I am.
Yeah, here we are, exactly. I love how you're doing the combination of therapy and mindfulness meditation on the side. I think it's such a powerful combination to be working on changing the mind, but also changing your relationship with the mind. And it seems to be, from my experience, we need to do kind of both, really, if we're going to really tackle it. Otherwise, the problems can kind of sneak in different places if you can't observe the mind. Have you found that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, I mean, mindfulness is useful for anyone and everyone, or most people, I think, regardless of if you're struggling with something or not. But I think with something like perfectionism, you really can get caught in sort of vicious cycles or unhelpful ways of thinking. And mindfulness can be such a great way to notice that and to interrupt it. So as you say, I think it can really kind of complement cognitive behavioral therapy. And I mean, for me, perfectionism is all about striving and wanting things to be better, sort of bigger and better, or different, essentially, to how they are now. And mindfulness, I guess, is a complete opposite, sort of sitting with how things are in this moment without wanting or trying to change them, without sort of striving.
But without the therapy, it can be an addiction, perfectionism. It can be a compulsion. There's an unconscious driving force that you can be sitting there trying to do the mindfulness, but there's this compulsion, right? And so it's so powerful to have the combination.
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. When I was doing my mindfulness teacher training, actually, there's one, it's sort of an intense week, and there's one of the days where you're essentially in silence all day. And I remember sitting there thinking, oh, I bet you everyone else is having these like light bulb moments, life-changing stuff, and I'm just not having that at all. And then it got to sort of the end of the day, and we all went back into the room, and we were then allowed to speak, and people were sharing their experiences, and I was like, yeah, they really have been having these great experiences, but I haven't. And then suddenly something just clicked, and I thought, I just had this realization, which probably sounds really simple now, but all the chatter that I have in my mind, the sort of perfectionist thoughts, you need to do this, you need to be better at that, let's do this, let's do that. I just realized that I don't actually have to act on them or respond to them. I can just let them be there. And I feel like that was quite a shift for me, just to realize that, even though it maybe sounds quite simple now, I think I just hadn't I hadn't really thought of it until that point.
But that is such a perfectionism habit of comparing yourself to others. So we're sat there in silence going, I bet they are having a better time. So talking of
Yeah.
symptoms,
Yep.
you see the link there? See the seamless link? Talking of
Very
symptoms,
seamless.
one of the
Perfect.
reasons one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you is because um, I met you through Instagram. I followed you and saw like such great stuff. In fact, what's your Instagram handle while we're here?
It's at the perfectionism therapist, but it's the perfectionism therapist.
Cool. So maybe someone will put that in the chat box at some point and everyone can follow you before the end. But the perfectionist therapist.
Yeah, the perfectionism therapist.
Fantastic. Fantastic. So one of the reasons I loved your page was because you had such informative like infographics and really clearly, thank you, Antonia, really clearly like setting out all the signs and symptoms and other things as well. Would you mind if you can remember some of them? I know it's Sunday evening, but would you mind kind of going through some of the common signs and symptoms of perfectionism so we can understand what that term even means?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really important because often, well, I mean, in the sort of field of psychology and therapy, there are perhaps different definitions, although they're generally all quite similar. But often people maybe aren't quite sure what perfectionism really is, or they think, I think I'm a perfectionist, but I'm not quite sure. And you kind of get those that are like I'm definitely a perfectionist, those that are kind of, I think so, I'm not sure. And then you get those who maybe come across my page and have no idea, and they read it and they're like, you're describing me, I must be a perfectionist.
Mm-hmm. I had that.
But I guess,
I didn't know I was until I read all this stuff about it.
oh, really?
I was a recovering one, let's put it that way. I still
Yes.
have some traits that I worked on, but it was really cool to see.
Oh, yeah, that's good. I like to call myself a recovering perfectionist as well. But I guess, I mean, for me, the main things is that a perfectionist is someone who relentlessly strives for extremely high standards that are often really personally demanding, and they're often quite unreasonable standards as well. And this is very much then linked into how you judge your self-worth on your ability to strive for and to achieve and meet those standards that you set yourself. So you can already see how you're kind of setting yourself up for failure a little bit, in the sense that the standards are really high, a bit unreasonable, and your self-worth is based off of being able to meet that. And often perfectionists then experience quite negative consequences of trying to pursue these really tough standards, often at the cost of kind of other areas of their life, whether it's family life, doing hobbies, or anything other than, I guess, the thing that you're wanting to strive for and achieve, which often can be work for people, but it can also, I guess, show up in all areas of your life. So, you know, someone might experience a lot of perfectionism around the home. You know, they want to have a show home or want it to look perfect, or they want to have the perfect relationship, or kind of the perfect life, should we say. And then I guess it can kind of translate into lots of different behaviors. Things like list making. Don't worry if you make lists, doesn't necessarily mean you're a perfectionist, but sort of endless list making, self-criticism, burnout, wanting to feel in control, imposter syndrome happens a lot for perfectionists. Maybe repeatedly checking things, checking that it's perfect. Often other people might describe you as a perfectionist, maybe even if you're not so sure. Or you might come from a family of perfectionists. I'd say that's probably relevant for me. And I think the big thing is that often people maybe think perfectionism is a positive thing, or it often comes up in interviews. It will be like, you know, what's your area of weakness? And people might be like, oh, I'm a perfectionist, but thinking, you know, the person's going to love that because it means I'm really good at working hard or something like that. And I guess there are some positives of perfectionism in that you know, you might achieve lots of things and you might have high standards, but I guess the not so good part is how you do that, how you try and reach that. And that you don't have to have both. You can have high standards and do well without being a perfectionist.
And we'll maybe come on to that later because I think I learned from you this dialectical thinking, but we'll come on to that. Was it you I heard?
Okay.
But there was a quote, I think, that I read when I was researching it. And again, I don't know if it was from your page, but you said that, or someone said, that perfection is not about being perfect, it's about never being good enough and about never failing. And I thought that was such a
Yeah,
powerful way of putting it, right? Because they also
absolutely.
have the idea that it's about being perfect, but actually what's really about is not never really feeling good enough.
Yeah, definitely. I think any perfectionist that I meet or work with, that's always what's underneath it. Yes, there's a drive to want to be perfect, but it's because it's shielding you from sort of what's at the root of it, which is a fear that you're not good enough or that you're worthless or that you're a failure in some way.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess from a CBT perspective, how we'd understand it is that all those standards and all the things you do are sort of guarding against that negative core belief that you hold against yourself, which you're desperately trying for it not to be true. Essentially, you're trying to do everything to make sure that you are good enough.
So as a takeaway, someone listening to this, they're going to be wanting to the best of the ability, find that core belief.
mm,
And what kind of
yeah.
core beliefs do people tend to hold a guard against themselves that you mentioned earlier? What sort of beliefs feel like?
Yeah, so I mean, common ones that I often see when working with perfectionists would be I'm not good enough, or I'm worthless, or I'm unlovable, I'm a failure, I'm stupid.
Mm-hmm.
And these are quite often things that we aren't necessarily always aware of. They might sort of be like squashed deep down. And it's maybe not until we have therapy that we can uncover them with a therapist and then work on them. Or maybe it's not until things don't go well, that's when we realize. Because sometimes for perfectionists, a lot of the time, maybe things do go well and they do meet all their standards. So things are kind of feeling all right. But then suddenly, if you fail, it can be really, really difficult and kind of come out of nowhere that suddenly you're just feeling like I'm worthless.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
So we're
so I
already
think
going to talk. Sorry, I thought you were finished.
and I was just going to say, I think usually a good place to work on things like core beliefs is in therapy, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But I was going to ask you, seeing as we're kind of starting to talk about the causes,
Mm,
what are the kind of the causes of that? Like when you're working with people and you're mapping back, like is there a particular
mm.
kind of parenting style that tends to kind of create this, or certain early life trauma events that are kind of common? Like what do you find comes up often?
Yeah, I think definitely the things that you just mentioned can be part of it. I'd probably say it's not one single cause, it's often a mix of things. Um, so that can be definitely our parenting or parental style from when we were growing up. So if our parents were highly critical, for example,
Mm-hmm.
that could have an impact on us. Or if our parents themselves or our family members are perfectionists, we kind of learn through modeling, learning behavior from others essentially, and then copying that. Or also sort of reward and reinforcement. High standards are often praised in society. We kind of see them as like a good thing, or that person's got really high standards, that's amazing. Or if you do really well at school, you get lots of praise from your teachers and everyone says well done, you're a good girl, etc. So I think a combination of those, along with I guess perhaps a bit in there around genetics and your sort of individual personality traits, and then things that can develop over time, like a fear of failure or a fear of not being good enough, or a fear of disapproval from others is quite a common one, and just sort of feeling like you need to prove yourself in some way, or you need to prove your worth. I
Well,
think a mix of those things.
you mentioned fear a few times there. So are you saying that
Mm,
you see people that are presenting perfectionism, they're often also presenting anxiety?
yes, definitely. I think you can see anxiety or depression or both. Um, often if a perfectionist is sort of in that mode of like do, go, strive, they can be feeling quite anxious, because I mean, it's scary if you fear failure and you have to go and do something, let's say something new that you've never done before. You're probably going to be feeling quite anxious, because in your mind, if you don't do well at this, then you're worthless, let's say. And then often I might see people who are quite depressed or burnt out, because it can be exhausting being a perfectionist. And that can then contribute to feeling low in mood. Or let's say you do fail at something, you're then probably criticizing yourself, thinking I'm rubbish, etc. So yeah, I think often it can show up in different ways. And someone might come to me, either there are those that come to me saying, I'm definitely a perfectionist, please can you sort this out? Or I get others that come to me, you know, I'm really struggling with anxiety or burnout or something like that. And then we uncover, okay, perhaps this is perfectionism that's underneath this.
Before we move on to self-worth stuff, because I want to ask you about the links between perfectionism and self-worth, and what self-worth is to you and stuff. I think I remember you sharing, like, is it the 5 types of perfectionism or something? There's a list of like 4, 3, 5. I think it's 5.
Oh yeah, the different types of perfectionists.
Yeah, I know I'm putting you on the spot now.
I know, that's fine.
But you remember them before I ask you the question?
Yeah, I think okay. I'll have them. They're on my Instagram. And this is work that was done by, I don't know if any of you may have heard of her, Roz Shafran. She's sort of like queen of perfectionism in the CBT world. And I've had lots of training with her. And she was the one who coined these different types, which I really liked, because I thought, okay, I definitely sound like this one.
But it'd be fun if you could kind of go through them with a brief description of each. Maybe those lists and maybe go, well, maybe if I am one, I might fall under that category. Yeah,
absolutely. Let me get them for you here. Okay. So 5 different types. We've got the first one. I'd say this is probably the one that I thought, okay, I think that might be me. And that's the driven academic achiever. So someone who must always achieve 100% without fail. And then you can get what we call the risk evader. So someone who exhibits an all or nothing approach, and they can often lack the confidence to maybe try new things. So they don't like risk. Then there's the aggravated accuracy assessor. I definitely put my hand up for this one, and I drive myself insane. That's someone who must achieve exactness and is quite fixated on the redos, which my fiance would probably say that's what I'm like with my website. Just constantly
I think my fiance would say the exact same thing about me and my website.
Yeah.
And my books. Like when I'm doing I love the editing of the book, but I think it's because the editing stage, the pressure's off and I'm just tweaking.
I was about to say I love tweaking bits on my website as well, but my fiance is like, oh my God, she's doing it again, tweaking. And then there's the controlling image manager. So that's someone who wants to be and be seen as perfect. So it's kind of about that image of perfection. And then the last one, which lots of people can usually relate to, is the procrastinating perfectionist. So someone who's often quite paralyzed by fears, you know, fear of failure, fear of not doing something well enough, and lots of self-doubt that then kind of impair their ability to start or finish something. So then they might procrastinate.
Okay, great. Wonderful summary. And I've got a couple of questions that link in with this. Number one, I assume you can be more than one of these, Caroline asks.
Yes, definitely. I mean, for me, the driven academic achiever and the aggravated accuracy assessor, that's a bit of a mouthful, that one. I definitely, for me personally, relate to those two. And I think we can change throughout life as well. If I think back to a teenager, what my perfectionism looked like, and maybe what it did 5 years ago, or how it looks now, I think perfectionism can change a bit in terms of how it shows up in your life.
I'm assuming this isn't just another label to give yourself. I'm now a aggravated assessor or whatever it is. What this can do is it shines a light on the kind of type of perfectionism that you might be demonstrating. And therefore you can start more clearly from there looking at the causes. That's what I
Exactly, yeah. And I think Roz, who spoke about this, was sort of presenting it in sort of a playful way, in that, there can be different types of perfectionists who tend to maybe focus on different things or have different drivers or fears. But as you say, it's about being able to build that self-awareness and maybe spot these things in yourself that often people put down to, oh, that's just my personality. But actually, maybe it's not always just your personality. It could also be perfectionism.
Which leads to my other question that came in. How did you realize that you were a perfectionist in the first place? I know you touched upon it earlier, but how did you actually realize? Like, where was the moment when you were like, OMG, and what was going on in your, was it what emotion or what was going on for you to really come to this conclusion?
Yeah, good question. I think I'd probably say that later on in my life, so perhaps having more distance between my real perfectionist behaviors, maybe as a teenager, and then later on in my sort of late 20s, having therapy and exploring things and looking back at things I did and thinking, gosh, that was actually really extreme. Like, let's say in my A levels, in my AS level before the final year, I think I got like a low A in one of my exams, and I thought I'll just do it again and get a higher A, so that then in my final year I don't have to work as hard, because if I get high B, I'll get an A overall. And I mean, saying that out loud, that sounds ridiculous. Redoing something so you can get a better A. And so I think that was maybe started to be a few light bulb moments, but then just, I guess, also reflecting on how I am now, or sort of was then in my late 20s, and how lots of my behaviours perhaps were linked to perfectionism, sort of very black and white thinking, or very all or nothing, either sort of like really on it, go, 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 achieving, striving, or then just the complete opposite, like exhausted, burnt out, and procrastinating. So I think probably really through therapy, gaining self-awareness, and then having knowledge as a therapist, having trained and learned what perfectionism is, and kind of putting the two together. Because it sounds silly, but sometimes you can learn something, someone can tell you something, but you might not necessarily relate to it until you really explore yourself or become more self-aware to then put the two together.
Absolutely. I can really relate to that. Repeating to get a better A. That's so.
Yeah.
I remember when at university I missed a first by like I was told it was like by a 0.0 something, and I remember going into the car that on the way home before I went home and just crying in the car because I'd missed a first by 0 point something. But in retrospect, it doesn't matter. But I remember that, and I tell you what, we got very similar traits when it comes to perfectionism. So I think our parents would probably get on really well because they sound quite. They must be quite similar. Anyway, love that. Happy Father's Day, by the way, if my dad's watching. So thank you for that. Great summary of perfectionism. Let's see if we can make the bridge between that and self-esteem and self-worth. So what is the link? What is the link between perfectionism, self-worth, self-esteem?
Yeah. Maybe in some ways it's probably helpful if I say how I think of self-esteem and self-worth, because they're kind of the same thing, but then they're also not. And sometimes we're not too sure. I mean, I certainly wouldn't be if I wasn't kind of really into learning everything about this, what the differences actually are, and then how they link to perfectionism. So I guess for me, self-esteem is all about how you evaluate yourself, so how you think and feel about yourself, and that can often change based on how things are going in your life, your mood, your circumstances, how other people are responding to you. So self-esteem can fluctuate, whereas your self-worth, I think, is something that's more global and sort of like a more stable form of self-esteem that just comes from knowing and believing in your worth as a person. So if we think of self-esteem as how we evaluate ourselves, and then and I guess that could be good or bad sometimes, Self-worth is that belief that we're lovable or that we're valuable regardless of how we evaluate ourselves. So we might have failed at something and we're feeling pretty rubbish about ourselves, and maybe our self-esteem is a bit low, or maybe it's hit rock bottom, but our self-worth is that I still know that I'm a valuable human being in society, or that, I'm still worthy of love or lovable, that kind of thing. And I guess that self-esteem, and in terms of how that links to perfectionism, I guess you can be a perfectionist and have low self-esteem, or you can be a perfectionist but not necessarily have low self-esteem. And then I guess your self-worth, that's very much linked to perfectionism, because again, comes back to that sort of definition of perfectionism, which is that your self-worth is tied to your ability to achieve. And that's why I think perfectionism can actually be really, really dangerous or really difficult in some ways, because it's not like, it's linked to my self-esteem. If I don't do well, I feel a bit rubbish about myself today, but tomorrow I'll feel better again. If it's linked to your self-worth, that's sort of, unless I achieve or do well, I am unworthy as a human being. I'm just like a waste of space, or I'm not lovable. So I probably just waffled on a bit there, or maybe confused you all more.
No. I shared something similar last week with the guys when talking about this, and I'm glad you did correct me by saying they are different. They're often interchanged, these terms, but actually they are significantly different. I'm grateful that you said that. But I'm wondering what the takeaway is for someone when they listen to this, based on these definitions. Like, they can probably know themselves quite quickly if it's self-esteem is their issue, or self-worth is their issue, based on the definitions, because self-worth is much more global and much more like, do I matter? Am I worthy? Should I even be here? That's why I think you say it's a bit more dangerous, right? Because you're moving into bigger territory.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess low self-esteem, as you say, people tend to know and tend to come and tell you, I've got low self-esteem, I feel rubbish about myself, I'm really self-critical, I don't like kind of going to social events, and I'm withdrawing because I just feel like, no one's going to want to talk to me.
Or they'll use the word confidence.
Yes. Absolutely.
Exchange it with confidence, right?
Yep. And often someone with low self-esteem maybe can be someone who sort of doesn't like to rock the boat, or they might be sort of people pleasers. They might not be good at prioritizing their own needs or self-care. Generally, I think people with low self-esteem tend to be very, very nice people. But some of that might come from a place of that sort of fear of not wanting to rock the boat or upset people, and they'll sort of go above and beyond to be liked and be really nice and helpful, etc. Often they might kind of claim that any luck, any sort of successes are just down to luck or fluke. They just don't really believe in themselves very much. But I guess the good news is that self-esteem is absolutely something that can be built and improved on, and the same with self-worth. We just might approach them differently at times during therapy.
Well, I'm really curious what you mean by that. So how would you go about it?
Yeah, sorry, that was dangling a carrot there, wasn't it?
As a therapist listening to this, I'm like, okay, tell me. We're moving into that. I think we're at the point of our conversation where we are starting to talk about, okay, we understand the issue now. So how do we start healing this perfection, for example? And one way would be to rebuild self-esteem and self-worth. To help with, So today, let's focus on these two. How can we rebuild self-esteem and self-worth?
You can do it in lots of different ways, and that doesn't necessarily always include therapy. Therapy is absolutely a great way to do it, but the good news is that you can do it yourself, before therapy or without going to therapy. And there are sort of quite simple, effective things like, journaling is good in the first place. Just taking 5 minutes each day to sit and write down how your day was, how you're feeling about yourself, just to start building that self-awareness more, so you can maybe start to recognize if you are quite self-critical. And then that can lead on to, I guess, something else that can be useful, which is spotting and noticing when you are criticizing yourself, and trying to challenge that a little bit, or maybe come up with some alternatives. So if you have a thought, I'm rubbish because you failed your driving test, let's say, you might be able to challenge it and say, okay, I'm feeling like a bit of a failure because I failed my driving test, but actually I'm still a good person and I've achieved XYZ, so I'm not a failure overall. Just sort of anything can be helpful, just to create a bit of flexibility in that negative thinking. Or acknowledging your positives is definitely a good one, even if it's keeping a daily journal and writing down one positive thing about yourself, whether that's something from the past or even just something day to day, with an example. Like, I held the door open for someone today. That shows I'm a polite person. There we go. That's a nice positive quality. Maybe taking on challenges to try and boost your confidence a bit. I guess unless we change our behavior, then our beliefs might remain unchallenged. So if we think, I'm not good at that, or I can't do public speaking, unless we go and do it, then we'll probably continue to think I'm not good at public speaking, or I can't do it. And stop comparing yourself to other people. Maybe unfollowing some people on social media, on Instagram, if you find that you're comparing yourself. So I think there are lots of things that you can do outside of therapy, which can be useful. And I think for working on self-worth, perhaps all of those things, but definitely also developing some self-compassion, which
I saw that.
lacking.
I saw that phrase on your website. I was hoping you'd bring that up. And what's self-compassion for you?
Yes, great question. Probably not going to give the perfect answer, but that's absolutely fine. I guess for me, self-compassion is about being kind to yourself, and kind of recognizing that common humanity, in that we all suffer, and we all can have difficulties, difficult days, etc., where we might feel rubbish about ourselves, and sort of we're not alone in that. It's kind of just part of being a human. And I guess it's something about taking it less personally, in that we are still worthy as humans. We're all in this together, and if we are suffering, then it's important to have compassion for ourselves and to be kind to ourselves. And I think it's often something that people can really struggle with, the idea of having compassion for ourselves. We feel like, isn't that a bit self-indulgent? Or, is that going to make me weak? There can often be quite a lot of barriers to self-compassion, but it's so important, particularly for perfectionists who don't have much self-compassion.
That's really nice. Thank you. My only concern is I might have to unfollow you on Instagram, because I compare my wall to your wall, and your wall is much prettier than mine, much better, more branded and organized. So, no, I'm
that's because I'm the fixated on the redos, the tweaking. You should have seen there's been 1,000 different brand colors before I've landed on this one.
Well,
now I've embraced it, and I thought, do you know what? It is what it is. It's just going to stay as it is. Like, if I ever put up a post and there's a spelling mistake, but I purposely leave it now, because it's good to challenge my perfectionism.
I think you actually should just do a typo in your official logo. Just to, if this logo bothers you, hire me. That's what you should.
Do you know what? Do you know what I did do? Although I changed it, so I should go back and do it now. Is my bio's got 3 different lines, and I started them all without a capital letter, because I was like, that really bothers me. And
even worse, to only have
something
one with
good to sit with.
Even worse to
Oh,
have just
I
one
don't know
one
if
looked
I'd quite
after.
be able to deal with that.
But anyway, moving on. So we've got some really practical tools there and tips there for increasing self-worth. And just with the journaling thing, something I've not done before. So I'm really curious, like, what happens if you just journal and it's all negative? Like,
Hmm.
what does someone do if they're just journaling and it's like really kind of just cyclical thinking, almost like it doesn't feel like it's helping? What kind of top tip would you
Yeah.
recommend to them, like they do?
Yeah. I mean, I guess if we think a couple of things, um, I'd probably congratulate someone and say, that's brilliant that you've noticed and recognized that actually all of your journaling is really negative and quite repetitive, and you've spotted cycles in your thinking. Like, that's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Because unless we have that self-awareness as that first step, then we kind of can't even really get on to the second step of making changes. How can we make changes if we don't know what we actually need to change, or what the problem is? But I guess in terms of answering the question in a practical way, if you find that you're journaling and it is all really negative, then yes, maybe it could prompt you to think, am I feeling great about myself? Maybe not. Maybe would it be helpful to have therapy? But if you're not into therapy, and that's fine, maybe just sort of evaluate, is journaling helpful for you? Is it actually making you feel worse? Does it lower your mood every time you've sort of sat and journaled? And then maybe it's not for you, and that's okay. And maybe kind of expressing yourself or becoming more self-aware in other ways might be better suited. Because sometimes if we have a tendency to ruminate, which is when we think about things from the past, usually negative things, over and over again, then I guess we don't want to get caught in the trap of kind of ruminating whilst we're journaling.
Mm-hmm.
And if we're starting to think, oh, it is journaling for me, we could try, before we think, nope, I'm not doing that again, maybe journaling in a more structured way. So rather than just a blank piece of paper and write down, any thoughts that come up, that's what I tend to like doing. But you can do it in a really structured way where you have particular prompts asking you, what's one thing you're grateful for today? What's one thing that you did that was positive today? What's one thing you struggled with today, and how did you overcome it? Or how would you like to overcome it next time it happens? So things can be kind of framed more carefully, perhaps.
Thank you for your honest answer. And I think it's great. I'm glad you got to the end there to the whole, but you could do it more structured and actually use it as a tool to, share whatever is there, but also at least, even if you just end with one thing that that went okay today, and
Yeah,
you start opening a door.
exactly.
But it's also, what I'm hearing is journaling. It's important not just to get lost in the words, but also to take a bit of a step back and know why you're doing it. Look for some patterns, look for themes, to become more self-aware in that way. Cool.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. So we're about to bring this part of our chit chat to a close. Well, in a few moments, we'll go over to the people on the line to see if they have any questions or anything they want to share with you. What is it you'd love to, make sure you've conveyed today when we're talking about perfectionism, self-esteem, self-worth? Is there any kind of parting words or something that you really think I need to ask you about, or you really want to share for this to feel complete?
Yeah. I guess, sorry, I'm just changing the view so I can make sure that I can see you all, so it feels like I can share it with you. I think for me, it would probably be, how can I explain it? Okay, maybe I'll say it in this way. So as a human being, I tend to think that perfectionism is a good thing. But as a therapist, I know now that it's not. So as a perfectionist, I tend to think or feel, well, it's got me to where I am, and I've been really successful in my career, etc. But I then have to remind myself, as the therapist with more training and knowledge in this area, that actually you can achieve and get all of that without being a perfectionist or having all the perfectionism baggage that goes with it. And I now know that, having worked on myself and having helped lots of other people, that you can be a high achiever or have high standards, etc., without being a perfectionist. So maybe feels a bit negative, but
no,
the message is probably that perfectionism isn't necessarily a good thing, and it's worthwhile working on it, because it can leave you more vulnerable to things like anxiety, depression, eating disorders, etc.
Mm-hmm. Oh no, I think it's great. Beautiful answer. And the way you answered it, I don't know if you're aware of this, but you were using dialectical thinking, which I did say we were going to talk about before we ended today. I don't know this and
Yes.
that. So can you just, before we close this for the podcast or whatever this is going to be used for later, what is dialectical thinking and how can it help you overcome perfectionism and even improve self-worth and self-esteem?
Well, that is a brilliant question. And to be honest, you may have to answer the question for me, because I don't know if it was me
Oh,
who you'd
really?
seen who had spoken about that before. But I'm chuffed that I know what it is without really knowing what it is, or that I'm doing it.
You did it. Well, dialectical
But so
thinking
please tell me.
No, you're gonna. You put me in the spot. This might not be the perfect definition, but dialectical thinking is basically an antidote to extreme thinking, extreme black and white thinking.
Okay.
So you know about that, of course, with all the training you've done. Where we'll talk about that a little bit then. What perfectionism, they tend to have that kind of extreme thinking, right?
Yeah, really. Usually call it black and white thinking, or all or nothing thinking. And it can be sort of very extreme. Either I've got 100% and that's great, or I've got 90% and that's rubbish and I failed. So very extreme, and we can often struggle to see the shades of grey in the middle.
Exactly.
That okay, maybe I didn't quite get what I wanted to get, but this is still fine. And so I think a big part of it is just becoming more aware of when you're falling into that trap of all or nothing thinking. Like I maybe notice it, say with cleaning the house, I'll feel like I want to do it all and thoroughly and really well. And if I don't have time to do that, then I'm not going to do it at all. Which is then just ridiculous, because then the house might be messy and dirty, and actually if I just do it more in the middle, shades of grey, it would probably be better.
Exactly. But dialectical thinking is a practical tool. It would be like I can not get the whole house cleaned and still be a good mother or father.
Yeah.
I can. I think I've got an example in my inbox about burning an onion as part of making dinner. So the whole thing was ruined. So it's like I can burn the onion but still be a good cook. These are probably really lame examples, but I'm trying to. I can get 90%. I can get less than what I was aiming for, but still be a good student or whatever. So it's just about opening that door up to not being so black and white. That's the idea between. So the example came in. I cooked a great meal and the onion was a bit burnt.
Yeah.
I can have a bad lesson but still be a good teacher. Is that a hint that we're not doing a very good job? Okay. So Ed, I'm just joking.
And that's probably something really common for therapists, particularly when they're in training. If their client's doing really well and coming into sessions saying, this is great, I've done this and I'm feeling much better, then after the session you're probably feeling like, yes, I'm a good therapist, I love this. But then if someone comes and says, oh, I'm really struggling, I couldn't do that, etc., then you might leave thinking like, oh God, I'm a really bad therapist. But actually it's not about that. You're perhaps still a good therapist. And this is just part of it. People are going to have good sessions, bad sessions. They're going to feel like they're doing well or not so well, and that's just part of the process.
Absolutely. Couldn't say it better. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
That's okay.
What's your website? What's your website? We got your Instagram handle earlier. What's your website?
Yes, NatalieEnglander.com.
And you're off from maternity leave now, or you're starting to phase out of it a little bit. So are you taking on clients and things?
Yeah. So I actually work in the NHS as a deputy clinical lead for a mental health service, and that's where I'm on maternity leave there for a year. But I also have my private practice. So I've just started to see a few clients in my private practice. And in September, I'll be running another mindfulness course that I do online, an 8-week mindfulness-based cognitive therapy course, just to ease myself back in a little bit.
Well, maybe we can get you back to talk about that.
Yes, I would love to. That would be
Great.
Brilliant.
It's a date. So thank you so much. And we'll bring this part of the webinar to a close. So until next time, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And if after listening you want to engage in some therapy to heal the hidden causes of perfectionism or low self-worth, you can work with Natalie by going to our website, natalienglander.com, or with me by booking some sessions at minddetox.com.